Hey guys, I'm just going to walk you through how I would edit my photos today. While my presets have been tested on all sorts of gear, Sony, Fuji, Nikon, Canon, these are my photos which are taken on Canon 5D3 and 5D4. So one of the things that I will tell you now is that I always shoot in manual Kelvin. So when I'm indoors, I will shoot quite cool, and when I'm outdoors, I will shoot quite warm. So it does help when applying your presets just to know what suits your style, and then you can get that consistency even more. So I'll just change this back to add shot and let's go through some of this. Now I'm going to walk you through what I do in different scenarios as well. So let's apply Golden Days 4, down the contrast. I'll just up the exposure a touch, and I would maybe even cool this down a tiny bit more. Okay, this one here is heavily in the shade. This was at a waterfall. So I would just apply Golden Days 2, maybe up the exposures just a touch, and maybe just the blacks, just a little. All right, let's see. I might go Golden Days 3 here, and I would just up the exposure. This one I wanted to show you because it was tricky. You've got warm walls, an orange curtain, so it can easily really cast those colours onto the skin. So I'm going to put Golden Days 5 on this, and you can see it does go very red because of the scenario. So I'd cool it right down, and then up the exposure even more. Then I would just down the orange and up the luminance of the orange a little bit just to expose their skin. Okay, so this one's in kind of full sun and shade, so it was a little bit tricky to get right in camera, but I wanted to show you full sun on this one. So I would just apply that, warm it up, and down the contrast a little, just because when you are shooting in that full sun, it does cast heavy shadows, and maybe just expose it a touch more. I'll just apply Golden Days 1 here and up the exposure. Just going to do Golden Days black and white, up the exposure a touch, and I've already painted on. I just wanted the shadows to come up on her hair there and the details of the dress as well, her little boy. I go Golden Days 2, with the exposure. I'm going to cool this one down a bit. Here I wanted to show you all the greens. So Golden Days 1 has pretty solid greens in it, but if that's, you're really loving a different one, for example, say like Golden Days 4 here, I'll just lift the shadows as well a bit, but you want the greens to come back. Come over to your saturation and click this little guy. Now, when you drag it up and down on here, it's going to pick up the colors that may not just be green. So Lightroom might be registering this grass as like yellow and green. So I'll pop it on here and then just pull it up a touch, and you can see over here they keep sliding up and down. It's picking up orange too. Look, it's not even doing green in this one. There you go. So you just up that a little, and then you can always also bring down the luminance, and that will just bring out that contrast in the green as well. Just do Golden Days 4 and the exposure a touch. This is another full sun. I would just cool it down a tiny little bit, and maybe just the exposure. Golden Days 4, and I feel like the blacks are very strong around here, which I love the punchy contrast, but if I wanted to avoid the blacks that are just happening sort of in the corners, which is creating that vignette, I would go to lens correction. So that's just lifted that up a little. Golden Days 3, what I love about these presets is they're working really well on darker skin. I know that, I've seen presets working in the past where they, might work fine on some skin and not on others. These seem to be working pretty well for different types of skin. So I'll just put Golden Days 2 on this one, up the exposure a touch, and I'll just reduce the orange the tiniest little bit. And that's it. This one I'm putting on Golden Days Black and White 2, which is the greeny one. And I might just down the exposure a little bit, make it nice and moody. And if you feel like the highlights are a bit blown out, you can always bring your highlights down over here, which is in your tone curve, and just crush them a little bit more. So your highlights are over in this corner here. This one I wanted to show you because it has a really strong green sort of cast, really strong greens around it again, but if you want to get rid of the greens on people's faces, I find Golden Days 4 works really well. So I would just actually warm this up even more. Sounds crazy, I know. And I would up the exposure a touch. So that's it before and after. So this one I'll do Golden Days 5. Yeah, just if I felt the reds were popping a little bit too much, I might just reduce the saturation of the reds, or I could even play with the hue of the reds and change them to like a more burnt orangey sort of colour, just so they don't distract from the photo too much. I'll just put Golden Days Black and White on this one. I'm happy with that, but if I wanted to, I'd maybe up the exposure and down the blacks to make it more punchy. Okay, so this one here, let's see, maybe Golden Days 2. And I would just down the exposure. And that's it. So one of the things that I do is shoot quite warm to retain highlights. And you can pull it down a little bit. It just helps with retaining highlights. Yeah, especially if you've got that haze as well. Golden Days 4 on these guys. And I might cool it down just the slightest bit. When there's a lot of warms going on around them, you have it super warm, it just bounces off everything. So I'll pull that back down when there's a lot of different warm tones around it. Then I'll just up the exposure a touch. I might use Golden Days 3 and just up the exposure and the contrast. Maybe, or I reckon Golden Days 2 on this one, and I would just up the exposure and that's it really. Golden Days 4 is the one with a lot of really nice pink sort of undertones to it. I might just pull it down just a touch and maybe just reduce a touch of the contrast. Up the exposure. I use Golden Days 4 on this one as well. I love Golden Days 4 for sunsets. And I'll just reduce the exposure a little. Let's see. Golden Days 1 I'll use on this one. So I'm just going to bring the exposure back down and I'll just use my brush, which I've already done. I'll just use my brush and say highlights. I'll bring the highlights down, the exposure down a touch, and up the saturation for my sky. And I'll just paint that back on a little bit, obviously being a bit more careful than I am right now, not to do people's heads and things. As you can see, if I up that saturation, it'll come right up. I might even down the whites just a little. And that's it. Or even warm it up. Golden Days 2. And I would just up the exposure just a touch. I don't love olive blue. I know that everybody does, but I don't. So I might just reduce the blue just a little, just because I like that really warm sort of vibe with mine. This is another full sun. Let's see. Okay, so full sun again, that's just with one click. I don't think I would change anything. If I feel the greens are a bit yellow, I might just reduce the yellow in the saturation. You can see that changing there. Again, indoors, I shot quite cool. I just warm that straight back up now. And maybe just lift the shadows. So another full sun, and I would just down the exposure a little and warm this one up. On days 3, just up the exposure. On days black and white, I would just up the exposure a touch, down the blacks. Golden days 4. I'm going to warm this one back up. This is another full sun. And I would just warm it up a touch, and again I would probably remove a little bit of the sky colour. It's going to pick up. Doesn't pick any colours up at all. There we go. That's really better. Golden days 4, or maybe golden days black and white. And this one. So golden days, let's say golden days 2, and I would warm that back up again. And that's it. Hope you enjoy.